Death is only the beginning. Be you a Buddhist, a Christian, a worshipper of Ra, Osiris, Odin, or Thor, the afterlife is where all the fun starts. Today's video is all about what ancient people thought was waiting for them on the other side. Let's start with Egypt's legendary Book of the Dead. Egypt's Book of the Dead. It all began in the sweltering heat of the Nile Valley, where sand gets in everything. And I mean everything, from your hair to your shoes to your very soul. In this sandy wasteland, the ancient Egyptians strived to prepare themselves for the ultimate journey. Their whole lives were focused on making sure their post-death road trip was a success. They built pyramids, temples, and monuments to the gods to help them out. And they compiled spells, passwords, and instructions into the legendary Book of the Dead. It's a very real Necronomicon. I'll come right out and be a spoilsport. The Egyptians didn't actually call it the Book of the Dead. That's a sensational name given to the collection of texts by modern scholars. The Egyptians called it the Chapters of Going Forth by Day, which kind of sounds like a self-help book with really poor sales. This wasn't some beach-read paperback with a tidy plot and a single author. Each copy was customized for the dearly departed, prepared by religious scribes. Some scrolls even left blank spaces to write in the customer's name, kind of like those insert your name kids books. Only these were the key to salvation. Perhaps my favorite part about the Book of the Dead is it isn't technically a book. It's just a collection of spells and instructions for beating death. Excerpts have been found scribbled on tomb walls, mummy wrappings, and even on King Tut's golden funerary mask. Calling it a book is a little misleading. You can put the spells in a physical book, yes, or you can pick and choose which spells, incantations, and evocations to leave on your dead loved one's coffin that you think will help them reach Egyptian heaven. But what did these spells do specifically? Each one walked the dearly departed through a step of the supernatural underworld. For example, there were spells to avoid getting decapitated, spells to remember a certain god to help you out of a bind, names to invoke to avoid doom, you know, that sort of thing. Because trust me, the Egyptian underworld was a hell of its own. After death, there were a whopping 42 gods waiting to grill you like you were on the world's most intense game show. Star judges included Osiris, the resurrected god king who looked like a wrapped-up zombie, and Re, the sun god. First, you joined the god Re to rise as the sun, travel across the sky, and descend into the underworld at dusk. Once there, you stood before a panel of gods like you were trying to sell a weird invention to the sharks. You had to answer each question the gods asked correctly, speak the right names at the right times, and cast certain spells when appropriate. If all this was done right and you succeeded, then your heart was weighed against a feather. If it was the same weight, you were good to go and join the gods in paradise. If your heart was heavier than the feather, your soul was consumed by a monstrous beast named Ammit and you no longer existed. It was really an all-or-nothing kind of situation, like putting it all on black and spinning the wheel. The Book of the Dead helped people get through this ordeal, but it wasn't a sure thing. Your heart still had to be pure, meaning you had to have lived a decent life. Would your heart be lighter than a feather? Or if you died today, would your essence be consumed by Ammit? 49 Days of Dying, Tibetan Book of the Dead. Death, the true final frontier, the one that no one has ever come back from. Unless you happen to be a Buddhist, in which case death is only a transition that involves 49 days of mourning. Why not 50 to appease all my OCD pals watching? Let's find out. Think of it as a gap year for the human soul. In Tibetan Buddhism, the 49-day mourning period after a body's demise is called bardo, which loosely translates to the in-between. It's like spiritual limbo, but with more chanting and less elevator music. During this time, the soul is believed to wander through a metaphysical escape room, facing its own karma, memories, and possibly 1-800 questions from celestial judges. It's not like the Egyptian afterlife at all. There's no panel of judgmental deities to appease. It's more like you're stuck living with all your mistakes in an ever-shifting karmic labyrinth. Depending on your life, this might be even worse than Ammit's Jaws of Oblivion. According to the Bardo Thadal, commonly known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, this interim journey can get intense. Legend says the original author of the Tibetan Book of the Dead was Padmasambhava, an Indian monk who brought Buddhism to Tibet and probably had a killer beard. But he didn't publish it on ancient Amazon. The text was hidden away for centuries, only to be rediscovered by Karma Lingpa, a 14th century Tibetan mystic. The book blends traditional Buddhist teachings with Bon, the pre-Buddhist spiritual stew of Tibet, creating a recipe for dying that was equal parts compassion, metaphysics, and mind-bending visions. There are different stages to death in Buddhism, which can be found in the Book of the Dead. First, you realize you're not breathing, which is awkward. Then you see your loved ones crying, but can't respond, which is more awkward. Next, you get your spiritual driver's license, a glowing weightless body that can walk through walls and teleport. So that part's pretty cool. There's just one catch. If you're clinging to your old life, or if your family won't let go emotionally, it can mess up your whole afterlife vibe. That's why the book gently tells the living, don't cry too loud and don't hold on too tight. The dead must be allowed to move on. Fun fact, it's been said that David Lynch's Mulholland Drive was inspired by the idea of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which makes sense if you've seen the flick because nothing else explains that movie. While the soul is busy advancing to the next step of its journey, the living are maintaining their 49 days of mourning. It's 49 because in Buddhist cosmology, 7 is a spiritually powerful number. Each of the 7 weeks in the 49 days marks a mini judgment for the soul. It's a cosmic performance review in which their soul either levels up, stalls, or spawns into something with feathers and no central heating. The mourning process is important because the living must perform special prayer ceremonies once a week to help the deceased pass their little spiritual tests. Buddhist teachings tell us that as the body decays, the soul prepares for its new life, and that new life is shaped by the soul's karma and the prayers of its loved ones. If you have no loved ones, sorry, I guess you'll be resurrected as a moth or maybe a dirty sock. On the 49th day, the last prayer ceremony is held by the living. By now, the soul's spiritual passport is stamped, and its next life has been booked. Think of the last day of prayer as the farewell concert, complete with symbolic offerings and sometimes lanterns floating away into the sky. Maybe some soft crying too, but of joy rather than sorrow. It's quite the ordeal, but there's something to be said about such dedication to the dead. Is 49 days of mourning too much, or are Western cultures doing too little to celebrate our ancestors? And now for a quick break. But first, I wanted to give a shout out and big thank you to Swedelsund and Andy Damit for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this. Do Jews go to heaven? You die. The light fades. You wait for a grand celestial voice to say, "Welcome to heaven," but it never comes. Then you realize, oh wait, I'm Jewish. I don't believe in heaven. Welcome to the incredible Jewish afterlife, where how you live beats where you go, and detailed maps of heaven or hell are about as useful as expired gefilte fish. Most people probably assume that Judaism, being so Christian adjacent, has similar ideas on heaven and hell, but that's not the case. While other religions offer cosmic roadmaps with toll booths and pit stops, Judaism isn't obsessed with the afterlife. The main focus is on Olam Hazeh, or this world. In other words, they focus on Earth as it is right now. The Hebrew Bible barely mentions what happens after you kick the bucket, because Judaism's primary concern is what you do with your time while alive. Kindness, justice, tikkun olam, repairing the world. That's the core of the Jewish belief system. Speculating about eternal paradise or fiery torment isn't really a Jewish thing. For many Jews, the afterlife is like season 2 of a show you're not even sure got renewed. So you binge the current one and blindly hope your subscription doesn't run out. Now, this doesn't mean Jews don't believe in an afterlife. Plenty do. While the specifics might be hazy, the Jewish faith does have a concept of Olam Haba, or the world to come. But understanding what it is depends on who you ask. Some say it's a literal heaven, others say it's a perfect future earth. Most Jews agree that before anyone can enter the afterlife, the Messiah must come. Everyone gets judged at the same time, and then the world transforms into some glorious injustice-free utopia where everyone's grandma bakes challah again and nobody fights over parking spots. In the meantime, while waiting for the Messiah, Everyone just kind of waits patiently in their grave in a dark void of existence. Not exactly the coziest waiting room. There's even a name for it: Sheol. Judaism even has its own kind of hell known as Gehenna. It's a divine place of punishment for those with bad or corrupted souls. But unlike the eternal damnation of Christianity, Gehenna is more like prison. Once your sentence is finished, you can move on with the afterlife, whatever the heck that is. To be frank, Judaism has one of the most confusing and convoluted afterlives of any religion. Some Jews even believe in Gilgul Neshamot, the recycling of souls. It's their own version of reincarnation. And if none of this tickles your fancy, there's always Techiyat HaMetim, bodily resurrection. It's believed that when the Messiah finally arrives, ETA still TBD, the good get raised from the dead. By the way, the Jewish Messiah is not Jesus Christ. No one knows who he is because he hasn't shown up yet. Hanging in Hades, the Greek afterlife. The sky darkens, a storm brews, somewhere a goat bleats in the distance. You just kicked the bucket in ancient Greece. Congrats, you're officially dead. But don't get too comfy, your afterlife is about to be judged harder than a fashion show on Olympus. In ancient Greece, death wasn't the end. It never is. It was more like a weird social media account that only stays active if people keep tagging you in throwback posts. Your entire posthumous existence depended on one thing: being remembered. In ancient Greece, immortality was less about divine powers and more about people not forgetting your birthday. And they didn't have Facebook notifications. When you died, you went to Hades, which wasn't exactly Cancun. It was gloomy and grey. And ruling this moody underworld was Hades, the original goth king, and his part-time hostage/wife, Persephone, queen of seasonal depression. Hades is a unique underworld because it's divided into a bunch of neighborhoods. Depending on what your family was doing about your memory up above, you got shifted from one neighborhood to another. There was Elysium, ancient Greece's gated community for war heroes and the spiritually bougie. Endless sun, soft meadows, maybe even good Wi-Fi. Elysium was where everyone wanted to go. But most people ended up in the Asphodel Meadows. Not awful, but you're definitely not bragging about it. The meadows were like, okay. Worst of all was Tartarus, where your soul gets dunked like it lost a bet with the gods. Reserved for the wicked, the cursed, and people who cut in line, Tartarus sucked. The second you weren't remembered by those up top, you slipped into the neighborhood of doom and gloom. But even being remembered wasn't great. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus pops into the underworld for a little visit and finds Achilles, the warrior, the myth, the man with the famous foot problem. Achilles was the hero of the Trojan War. Yet when Achilles meets Odysseus in the afterlife, he complains, saying he'd rather be a poor farmer on the surface than a king in Elysium. Even the good neighborhood was a letdown. Being dead in Greece was a sour apple no matter who you were or what neighborhood you got to live in. Still, you had to make the best of it, and that's why the Greeks had Eusebia, their unique concept of piety. Eusebia was your duty to show respect to the gods and to your family. Respecting the dead involved a proper burial, bringing the dead offerings of food and drink, and constant remembrance. Because every time you remembered them, they got to live it up in Elysium. And when you stopped bringing them snacks, they were downgraded to Tartarus. Want to be immortal, ancient Greek style? Live well, don't be a jerk, and hope your grandkids remember your name. Because once they forget, it's down to Tartarus with the other forgotten souls. Getting ghosted in ancient China. The mists roll in, a distant bell chimes, you feel a chill down your spine, and it's not just the air conditioning. You're being haunted by a Chinese ghost. Because in China there was no Book of the Dead. There were only disembodied souls holding grudges and tormenting the living. From dynasties long gone to today's spooky TikToks, ghosts have been haunting Chinese culture for eons. Ghost stories in China go way back to the Shang dynasty in 1600 BC, and they've never been friendly. Chinese ghosts were usually out for vengeance, closure, or attention. The idea was that when you died, your soul has to cross a bridge to the afterlife. At this bridge, you'd be judged. If you lived a virtuous life, great, keep walking. On the other side of the bridge is your next destination. Maybe you'll come back as a butterfly or a bureaucrat. It really depends on your karma. If your life was a dumpster fire, you would fall off the bridge and straight into hell. Literal hell. Off the bridge and into fire and brimstone. Chinese hell is like Christian hell on roids. Remember Dante's 9 circles of hell? Well, China hell has 18 levels, each one more savage than your mother-in-law during a mahjong game. Hell in Chinese law was organized. Every sin had its own dedicated punishment. Cheat on your taxes? There's a brutal punishment for that. Talk back to your grandma? Guess what? Fluorate's got your name on it. Ghost culture began to develop in the pre-Qin dynasty more than 2,200 years ago. Books like Notes on Searching Deities, The Story of Chinese Gods, and Journey to the West were packed with spirits, entities, and restless ghosts. One of the easiest ways to end up being haunted by your relatives is by skimping on their funeral. The ancient Chinese treated funerals like tech support for the soul. Skip the right rituals and guess what? Your dearly departed might show up at 3 a.m. in your bedroom mirror looking ticked. This was so important that the government made skipping funerals punishable by death. No one wanted ghosts meandering around the countryside. One of the spookiest ghosts is the Shui Gui, the spirit of someone who drowned and whose body was never found. Shui Gui are said to haunt the waters, desperately searching for a replacement body. Go for a moonlight swim by yourself, you just might turn into the replacement. So while China has a lot of different views on the afterlife, the one thing that's remained constant for thousands of years is the overwhelming fear of ghosts. Of all the places in the world, China might just be the most haunted of all. Would you rather be a restless spirit tormenting the living or trapped in hell? Personally, I think I'd rather be a ghost. The Cheyenne's world of death and grief. The prairie wind howls. A buffalo grazes in the distance. On the cold night air comes the sound of a funeral that would make Victorian-era mourning traditions seem half-hearted and tame. These are the funerary customs of the Blackfoot and Cheyenne tribes, 2 groups of nomadic legends who roamed the vast wilds of Montana and southern Canada, hunted buffalo like pros, and had some pretty amazing death rituals. The Blackfoot, traditionally known as the Niitsitapi, once roamed from Saskatchewan to Nebraska. The Cheyenne, their friendly neighbors, set up shop just a few teepee rows away in what's now northwestern Montana. Both cultures were kinship-based, buffalo-powered, and close enough to borrow a cup of pemmican. And while they shared a few rituals, especially around death, their views on the afterlife took very different spiritual highways. The point I want to make is that even though 2 Native American tribes lived side by side, their views on life after death were completely unique. Just like every Native American culture out there is unique. Before Christianity came rolling in with its pearly gates and fire pits, the Blackfoot believed the soul of the dead traveled east to the Sand Hills, a breezy paradise-like afterlife with zero judgment and excellent real estate. But you could only enjoy this paradise if your spirit didn't get stuck in the earthly plane. To make sure someone's spirit passed on, the Blackfoot had a method. First, run. Once someone died, the tribe abandoned their campsite immediately. Everything they owned had to be given to someone. That way there was nothing tying them to this realm. Lastly, the person was not buried. I repeat, no burial. The Blackfoot believed burying a body trapped their spirit in the ground. Instead of dirt burials, they left the body in a tree where it would be consumed by scavengers and ultimately absorbed into the tree's roots. This was a surefire way to avoid ghosts and to make sure the dead person found peace. Meanwhile, over in Camp Cheyenne, they were a little more ghost-friendly. For 4 days after a person's death, they believed their soul hung around like a homesick traveler, visiting family members as a spirit. After the ghost visited each of its loved ones, it was off to Sienna. Sienna was the heaven you never knew you wanted to go to. The Cheyenne believed the soul's final destination was at the end of the long fork of the Milky Way, as in out in space. They took the idea of heaven and juiced it, placing eternal salvation somewhere out in the universe. I should mention that the Cheyenne buried their dead in the ground, not up in a tree, and they believed that even once a person was dead and 10,000 light years away, they could return as a dream visitor. The Cheyenne said their ancestors could hang out with them in dreams, and honestly, I love that idea. How awesome is it to think your sleeping self is chilling with a few hundred years of ancestral ghosts? Could our dreams be connected to life after death? The Towers of the Dead. On the top of a rocky plateau is a blazing fire. A mysterious man in ancient robes holds up a glowing orb. It's a Zoroastrian death ritual practiced for eons by the religion that basically invented half of Western pop culture. Before Christianity, before Islam, before Voltaire had thoughts and Nietzsche had angst, there was a Persian prophet with swagger named Zarathustra, or Zoroaster if you're feeling Greek about it. He came along with a revolutionary idea. His idea was one God, one truth. Also, hell is very real and it's for all eternity, so you better behave. Zoroastrianism is a belief system that dates back to about 1500 BC, predating the Hebrew Bible by an estimated 500 years. The religion was founded by Zarathustra, who was bored of the polytheistic drama of the old Iranian gods. He introduced Ahura Mazda as the one true god. Up until this guy, people were happy worshipping all kinds of Iranian deities, but monotheism caught on. Soon Iran was gaga for Ahura Mazda. It defeated Iranian paganism in the same way Jesus and Christianity defeated the pagan gods of Rome and Greece. Zoroastrianism became the official religion of the Persian Empire. When the Persians rolled into Babylon and freed the Jews from captivity around 3,000 years ago, there were some exchanged ideas. Suddenly, Jewish theology had some new Zorro-flavored concepts. For example, a divine judgment day and an evil opponent of God. Many of today's religions have their core beliefs rooted in the original theology of Zoroastrianism. Hell is one such concept. Centuries before Dante wrote the Divine Comedy and took a literary tour of hell, Zoroastrians were already doing travel blogs of the afterlife in sacred texts like the Book of Ada Varath. The afterlife, according to Zoroastrianism, is very similar to the Christian afterlife. The only major difference is the burial practice. To this very day, Zoroastrians don't bury their dead. They place a recently deceased person's body on a stone pedestal known as a Tower of Silence. Then the body is left to be picked apart by vultures. Zoroastrians believe that fire, water, earth, and air are sacred and should not be polluted by the dead. Cremation is out of the question because burning the dead poisons the air. And burials are no good either because rotting flesh poisons the earth. So they let the dead be picked apart by birds until nothing but bones remain. The bones are bleached by the sun and therefore purified. Only then can the remnants of the deceased be collected and placed inside a well, where the dry air will naturally disintegrate them into powder. I'm speaking in the present tense here because the practice is still performed today by surviving Zoroastrians in India and Persia. However, things are changing in the modern world. The recent disappearance of vultures means the bodies are no longer being scavenged as they had been for the last 3,000 years. The Towers of Silence may finally go silent for the first time since Zoroaster walked among us. Would you rather be buried with the worms or left for the birds? Let me know in the comments, and if you're enjoying the video, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Where did Vikings go when they died? Vikings had ghosts too, but they weren't the kind you'd want to mess with. They were like revenants from Skyrim crawling out of the snow with axes and swords, ready to fight their way back into Valhalla. In the ancient world of the Norse, death was never just the end. It was more like a detour, an unpredictable, dramatic detour involving swords, sagas, and the occasional revenant corpse that eats someone. When you die in Norse culture, your soul could end up in several places, each with its own vibe. There was Valhalla, Odin's elite clubhouse. If you died gloriously in battle, congrats! You now get to drink, fight, and feast forever. No pants required. Can you name any of the other Norse afterworlds? Everyone knows Valhalla, and some might even know Hell, spelled with only one L. It was depicted by the Norsemen as a grey, depressing eternity for the average soul. No feasting, no fun. But it wasn't endless bee stings and hot pokers to the eyes either. The one nearly nobody knows except a few bearded scholars is Folkwanga. This little slice of heaven was the same as Valhalla, but it was reserved for Freya's warriors. Freya is, of course, the most important goddess in Norse mythology. She was the lady of love, war, gold, magic, and seeing the future. If you fought in the name of Freya, you went to Folkwanga in death and enjoyed all the benefits of Valhalla, but with less intense macho energy. What you might like most about the Norse afterlife is that there was no divine judgment, no scales, no heaven or hell verdict. Where you ended up depended on your prowess as a fighter. Or if you were just a farmer, you would end up in hell. Unless you were truly evil, in which case you would probably remain in your grave waiting to become a zombie. While most cultures had spooky floaty ghosts whispering boo, the Norse had monsters. Their restless dead grew taller, bulked up, and went full zombie Hulk. There were two types of risen dead in the Norse world. The Hogbui were chill but territorial. They stayed in their burial mounds like grumpy dragons guarding their burial goods. If disturbed, they could wreak havoc. The most common restless dead was the Draugr, which also happens to be in Skyrim. That's 2 Skyrim references in one video. Draugr were intensely aggressive, had super strength, and were constantly enraged. Draugr could come back to life for any reason. Maybe the funeral sucked. Maybe someone stole their lucky axe. Maybe they just hated you. Whatever the reason, if you didn't treat the dead right, you had no one else to blame when you were haunted by a dead guy who could punch a hole through your longhouse. What's scarier to you, an icy Viking Draugr or an Egyptian mummy with sand in its wrappings? Rome's obsession with death. Death in ancient Rome, where dying was a performance, funerals were a family affair, and even hairdressers had a shot at eternal fame. The Romans were obsessed with death, but not in a goth teen sort of way. For them, death was a stage, and you better believe they were putting on a show. You won't find a more gratuitously dramatic ancient civilization than the Romans. Yet their views on death were all over the place. They did share a lot of Greek ideas, but they made them all more flamboyant in typical Roman fashion. Pluto, their version of Hades, ruled the underworld. They believed in Tartarus just like the Greeks, but Tartarus was more akin to a fiery hell where only the irredeemable of society ended up. Where the Greeks really made death their own was in their funeral customs. They were about honoring the dead, but also about flexing for their neighbors. Rich people had tombs, statues, eulogies, and sometimes even a live reenactment of the dead person's life. The less rich people were stuck with communal burial walls called columbarium, which were like shared Google Drive folders but for ashes. Rich or poor, your funeral lasted 8 days. During that time, families laid low, hung cypress branches outside, and cried a lot. Close family members shut the eyes and mouth of the deceased. And one lucky relative got to light the cremation pyre and later scrape the bones out. Romans really took chores to the next level. Here's the thing though, Rome wasn't one religion. They had the Mithraic mysteries, dozens of other cultic mysteries, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, paganism, and probably 100 others. Remember that their empire stretched from Britain to Egypt and beyond. Rome was like America, with every religion under the sun being practiced by people from around the globe. Burial practices changed by the century. Up until the 2nd century, cremation was the way to go. But with Christianity on the rise, burials made a comeback. Apparently, heaven needs bodies intact. Otherwise, no eternal reward. The only part of society that didn't change much was the top part, as in the rich aristocrats. For them, religion was a moot point. They were all about celebrating the dead by turning their relatives into deities. They made wax death masks of family members and kept them in the main hall of their mansion like a creepy gallery of judgmental great aunts. During funerals, descendants wore the masks and impersonated their ancestors. That's actually kind of a cool idea. Behold, I am Grandpa Gaius, conqueror of Gaul, eater of figs. These performances were about lineage, legacy, and reminding everyone that your family had been awesome for generations and wasn't about to stop. Now let's test something out. Do you know your great-parents? Do you know their names? Are there pictures? Say what you want about the Romans, but they didn't forget their roots as easily as many families today do. It's no fault of modern people. It's just the culture we happen to be living in. The Romans visited the cemetery all the time. They buried their dead outside city limits, along the roads, just far enough to avoid bad vibes, but close enough for people to admire the tombs on their way to work. The Romans lived life like they were being judged not by gods, but by future historians. They wanted to die well, earn themselves a killer tomb, and leave a legacy carved in stone that no one would ever forget. I'm kind of on board with getting buried like a Roman now. I want my death mask on my family's walls so they have to look at me long after I'm gone. What about you? Let's say all the afterlives I've told you about today are real. Which one do you hope you go to when you die? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe and come back again real soon.